Mira Krishnan is a social entrepreneur and feminist activist. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees in engineering and a PhD in clinical psychology. She is former director for the Center for Autism at Hope Network in West Michigan, and recently co-founded a company to develop mobile learning games to empower preschool-age children. In her spare time, she works as consultant and diversity trainer to the LGBT and women's support communities and lectures across the country. In 2015, she was recognized as one of the 100 most influential transgender persons in the United States. After catching my breath reciting her impressive yet abbreviated biography, it is a real pleasure to welcome Mira Krishnan to Feel Like You Belong. Mira, thanks for joining us in the studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what you have in common with so many of our past guests is the immigrant experience. We talked about that. Your folks are both immigrants from India. Tell me what that experience growing up as a second-generation immigrant child has taught you about belonging.
You know, the funny thing about our experiences is that we only ever have one of them, and so we don't know what it's like to be what we aren't. So my parents came over from India. My parents are both chemists, and they came over. My dad came over for school. My dad worked most of his career at Pfizer, companies that eventually became Pfizer, doing process control chemistry, and my mom worked as an organic chemist for a while, and then worked intermittently after I was born. We grew up in Detroit. I was a young child in the late 70s and early 80s, and I wasn't really that aware that I was different at first. The funny thing is that my first language was Tamil, which is our native language, and I learned to speak English because I would play in the yard, and across the fence next door there was this boy my age, and we would play together. And I learned English playing with Paul, my next door neighbor. And so I knew obviously that I spoke another language that other people didn't speak. But it really was years over which I got to realize the differences. We had a really strong community in Detroit, and so being exposed to the Indian community gave me a larger family, because a lot of my extended family members were far away. My grandma was in India when she died, and this was when I was maybe in 4th grade, and my mom was in Holland, Michigan by then with me. And I remember how hard it was for her to be that far away from her mother when she died. And so I didn't have all of my extended family here, but I had the community, and that was really a beautiful thing. But really, it was a wonderful childhood. I enjoyed it. When I moved to Holland, I was very aware of race, at least at the level that, you know, I used to joke that when I moved to Holland, me and the 2 Italian kids were the diverse club, the ethnically diverse club at our school, because Holland in those days was very non-diverse. But even then, I've always had a fantastic experience. I think my community taught me ethics of hard work and investment in education. And people may not realize that that's something that you know, immigrants bring with them. But my parents both had master's degrees, and in their families, they were actually made fun of because they didn't have doctoral degrees. Oh my goodness. They were kind of the black sheep for not having that level of education. And in the family that I come from,
underachievers.
Yeah, well, if you said you had a master's degree, your aunties would be like, "So why did you drop out of school?" And that would be the assumption that they would make. And so that's something definitely that they brought with them, and it certainly functions as a privilege because college education went back even, you know, to the generation before that in my family. You know, they really emphasized, though, that their identities as Americans weren't always that important to them, but that my identity as an American was really important to my parents, is really important to my parents.
My understanding that among the Indian community, we think about, you know, India as a geopolitical entity, but in truth, there are hundreds of ethnic communities across India. And so my understanding is the Tamils would all get together and stay together, but not necessarily associate with wider Indian groups. So is that your experience?
The cool thing, I think, about being an Indian in America is that that isn't the case. There aren't enough of us. You know, and you see that change a little bit when there are very large ethnic populations, like, you know, in Chinatowns and things like that. But there weren't enough South Indians to just hang out with South Indians. And so I grew up around North Indians, I grew up around Pakistanis, I grew up around Pashtun, you know, like a word that is in the English language and in our lexicon now because of the war in Afghanistan, but I grew up around Pashtun people. Yeah.
So I'm going to follow your training a little bit because you have this background in engineering, and of course, Indian parents would be very proud of a child who goes into engineering or medicine, of course. But
there's one more field which is high tech. You have to be either an engineer, a doctor, or in high tech, and there are no other Indian-approved fields traditionally.
So then you shamefully took this wild veer off into psychology. But took with you still some critical thinking skills from engineering, and ultimately in your training did neuropsychology, and then specialized really in autism, which is a scary concept for a lot of Americans. In that work, what has that taught you about community and belonging?
It's taught me everything. When I went to grad school, I originally wanted to work with older adults. I got really fascinated with how some people, when they're 95, they're learning to program a computer for the first time or making new friends, but other people really seem like they're just waiting for the end. And I got really curious about what that difference was. One, because I wanted to be that woman who was learning new things when she's 95, but then also because I just wanted to understand what made them tick. I actually was introduced to kids at one of Paul Newman's hole-in-the-wall camps. There are a series of camps that work with kids with serious health challenges like cancer, epilepsy, heart disease. And I fell in love with kids there. And I fell in love with kids because I learned skills to play and interact with them. And I learned that those skills weren't inborn for all of us or most of us. And once I learned how to interact with kids, it turned out that they loved me and that I loved them. But the reason I tell you this is that my experience with that camp in particular, which very much parallels what I do in autism, is that I get two responses. I get either, that must be the most wonderful job in the world, or that sounds really awful, you must be so strong to be able to do that. And that's all the difference. I've always thought that it's the most wonderful job in the world. I love working with the kids and families I work with. Autism scared me before I understood it. But as I got to know these families, as I got to understand these kids' dreams and hopes and understand their parents, I find them a wealth of inspiration. And I find that they give me so much more than I give them.
What's a critical thing for the general population to understand about autism?
I think that one of the most critical things to understand about autism is that autism is in some ways both a disorder or a source of disability and a source of strength or power or resilience. We believe that the autistic brain is optimized in a way that makes autistic people better at doing certain kinds of things than the general population. And in some cases, maybe 10% of the time, it means that they aren't just better, but they have these really dramatic savant skills. Stephen Wilshire is an architect in the UK who's an autistic young man, and he's famous, for instance, he flew in a helicopter over New York City, and he was able to draw an accurate map of the entire Manhattan skyline down to the street level detail from one trip over the city in a helicopter. That's something that most neurotypical people, that's those of us who aren't autistic, that's something that we can't do. So not everybody has a gift like that, but we do believe that in general the autistic brain has some advantages, or some things that it's actually better at than most of our brains. There's some things that it's not as good at as most of our brains, although there's a lot of diversity among men and women who are neurotypical. There's also a lot of diversity among autistic men and women and people in general.
So a good way to think about it is it's another skill set.
It is. It's a type of brain architecture. It's good for some things and it's challenging for other things. It can be associated with a lot of disability. People ask me a lot if I am trying to cure autism, and I'm not. I personally don't believe in that. I believe in getting autistic kids to a point where they can chase their dreams. I don't know what those dreams will be. I don't know where they'll lead, but I want to give them the tools and I want to teach in a way that works for them so that they can have that journey on their own.
Awesome.
That's the thing I'd want people to know about autism, that it's both of these things. That kids need special help that other kids don't need, but that these kids can not only live amazing lives, but they can make the world a better place, not just for them, but for us as well.
Awesome, awesome. So last year you were given an honor. You were recognized as being one of the top 100 most influential transgender people in the country. You have a blog. You're doing a lot of speaking and advocacy. What have your experiences growing up as an immigrant child, your experiences in advocating for autism, what gifts do you take from there? What insights do you take from there into this new advocacy that you're doing very, very publicly and very powerfully?
Thank you. I think the biggest thing is that from the beginning of my life, I have thought of difference as a source of strength for communities and not as a weakness. Okay. I've always felt like our Indian heritage brought something to America rather than taking something away from it. And I advocated for people who are different than me when I work with the autistic community. I work with families that are poor, and I've never been poor. I work with families that are ethnically different than me. I work with families with different life experiences. Of course, I come from an immigrant family, and when I was coming out, I thought, I need to really practice before I tell my parents because I don't know what would happen. I had to get to the point where, I was ready for my parents to kick me out of the house and sit on the curb and call a cab back to the airport. But I didn't really think that would happen because that's not what my parents would do. Indian community tends to be very tightly knit, especially traditionally. And so I didn't really expect that anything like that would happen. I'd never heard of it ever happening to anybody that I knew, in my family for any reason, really. And of course that didn't happen. My dad said, I don't know why you came all this way to ask me if I accept you. Of course I accept you. You're my child. And my mom said, all right, well, if anybody has a problem with this, they're gonna have to come through me. And so that's how my parents responded. And when I look back as well at the kids I work with, I wasn't sure how my families would respond because there have been times when trans people have come out in school settings in particular, and this is a healthcare setting and not a school setting, but in school settings, they've come out and there's been a lot of controversy. And I joked that I couldn't ask my parents, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you accept me? Because that'd be disrespectful to me and in some ways to them as well. But I paid attention to what they said. And I work with about 50 families really closely. And of the 50 families, 70% of them were openly positive. There was crying and hugging. When I worked with, we serve a lot of Spanish-speaking Hispanic families and a lot of African-American families. When I work with the interpreters for some of our Spanish-speaking families, the interpreter was crying and hugging me, and the family was crying and hugging me. And people would say, you got to be you, and why'd you wait so long? Or I'm so sorry that, things weren't easier so that you could have come out a long time ago. Of the rest of the families, the other 30%, all but one said, okay, that's cool. If you need me to do something, you let me know, but I don't see a concern. And all of them have been at least good for their word, and if not better. Many of them have been really positive in the time since. Only one family had a moment, and that family, interestingly, left the clinic that day. And by the time I even heard that they'd left, they'd already had, their supports coordinator had called the office to make sure we didn't discharge the child. The child was back the next day. And that family stayed for a long time and ultimately left the clinic for other reasons. Yeah. But I thought that ethnic minority families would have a harder time accepting my LGBT status. I think that's internalized racism. My experience has been quite the opposite. My experience has been that that families get the way that different differences intersect and overlap, and the way that the experiences are the same. One of my families, when I came out to them, said, we know a thing or two about having a child who isn't anything like we thought that they would be, but then coming to realize that that child was pretty great the way they are. And they said, if we can do that, then you can do this. And I think they're right.
So we have to wrap up in just a moment, but as a parting word to our viewers, what would you like people to know about trans individuals?
You know, I think the same old story. We have a lot of gifts and skills to bring to the community. We have a unique experience in some ways, and we can't ever unsee that experience. But the biggest thing that we want is for all of you to get to know us. You're in the minority. Only about 17% of Americans know a trans person. The people who know us, you know, we're part of their communities and we feel very well accepted by them. We really just want to help all of you get to know us, and we think that you'll like us just fine.
Awesome. Awesome. I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your multiple stories with our viewers today. And continue success. We didn't have a chance to talk about your new company, but we'll maybe have to do that at a later time because that's fascinating as well.
I would really like that. Thank you so much for having me out.
Thanks.
And so I wrote the book because I wanted to really share and impart many of the lived experiences of what it means to live in post 9/11 America.